Mr. Ken Eriksen joins me on the show today. He came recommended from a coworker, a mutual acquaintance of ours. Began his career in the mid 90s as an economist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Uh, many things since then. Currently is a managing member and strategic advisor of Polaris Analytics and Consulting. Mr. Eriksen, thank you for joining me.
Tim, thank you much. I appreciate you reaching out and jumping on the show with you here. Fantastic.
Yes, sir. Admittedly, again, I know very little aside from a rather extensive resume here on LinkedIn. But Mr. Matt Tomeko, who I work with at Ingram, actually, I think had dinner with you when I was in town, but I didn't know about it till after. How did you meet Matt? What's your connection there?
Boy, Matt, I've known him several years in my previous company where we could probably get into that. Got to know him in a couple of different ways. One, used to publish the Barge Fleet Profile when I was at Sparks, Inform Economics, IHS Market, and then penultimately S&P. And then we also had a training school, a merchandising school. And Matt came to that. It was a 5-day course and got to know him there and then see him around different industry events and just keep up with regular phone conversations. And wherever we had a chance to meet one another, we'd catch up. So I was in Nashville, I think just earlier, and we got together for coffee, and him and another colleague there, Ben Zarnacki. So that was a good time to catch up with him.
Had you heard about the podcast prior to that?
I have, yeah. I actually started listening to it last year sometime and really enjoyed it and enjoyed some of the history that's on there. And quite frankly, as much as I find a lot of interest with like the Frank Mortons of the world and many others, a lot of your captains are quite intriguing, and the retired folks that have some unique experience on the river system. And I found a lot of kinship towards that given my family. But I think there's a lot to be learned because their eyes of just being kind of like boots on the ground really bring a lot of understanding and perspective that one misses when they're not as close to the water as they really are. So I've really enjoyed those.
Anything especially surprising or I guess enlightening?
I think there was a gentleman who, and I'm trying to remember his name. In fact, when I was going up to Nashville, I was listening to it because I'm in Memphis. So I was driving up, listening to the podcast, and he had a gentleman on. He was retired, but he ended up retiring, I think, from ACBL. He had spent time down in South America as well
Dave,
as back here. What was his name again?
David
Yeah,
Greer.
yeah, yeah. And what I found intriguing was a couple things with him. One, he's just got some great stories, but he's very well studied and knows not just the river well, but understands some of the economics of it. At the end of the day, the economics matter. And what was fascinating when you asked the last question, I was going to go in and speak to a group in Nashville. And I've kind of got a framework that I use with a lot of clients about, if you run into impediments, you run into challenges to try to move cargo, and to move it, you just don't have enough, say, capacity to move it. And now prices go up, and if prices go up, someone's got to pay it. And if you're moving a lot of different commodities, it's usually say if it's a corn or something, the farmer pays it in lower basis or weakened basis. And the same thing even at a coal mine or something like that. But then others have to just get higher prices charged to them. And then penultimately, what happens is that you shift competition elsewhere. And we see that, and that's happened, and it's an incredible story. But then you start diminishing the economic vitality of the area. Well, David at the very end said, when you asked him, hey, is there anything else? And one of the things was, we've got to find ways to be a bit more innovative in the system here and in the barge industry. And I thought that, from his perspective and things was quite fascinating. And some of that is just the processes that you use internally. And some of the innovations, not so much what's happening on the river, but that's true. But it's also some of the ways that companies might be managing their business or monitoring their business or monitoring the industry. And that was one of the things that really stood out to me as one who's getting to do quite a bit of different things in this industry again, and to look at that and be able to talk to some people. I think there's some unique things that can be done. And I thought that was a great conversation. And it was probably one of the last ones I listened to. But I wanted to go back and listen to it because I thought it was very well said. At the end of the day, though, you got towboats that are running, 5 to 10 miles an hour or knots, and you got all kinds of conditions. But what you're pushing and what you're doing is remarkable. And so where's the innovation that can come? Well, I think there's a lot that can be there. It also just means you got to push the pencil harder. But I thought that was a very unique understanding from him, that a lot of people have asked that same question over the years of ourselves and others that keep trying. And I think there's a lot of people wanting to try things, and he kind of stoked the flame on that one. I thought was really good.
Yeah, I found him, I believe, in Facebook comments, as a matter of fact. And we connected and we recorded from Christmas break. I think we recorded and published about 6 hours. So there's likely some stuff you haven't seen yet with him. Extraordinarily interesting guy, fascinating perspective. He he's actually due back on, possibly with some other guests here coming up soon. But before we get into your story, do you want to dig into what you were just discussing any further? What sort of innovations, what sort of opportunities do you see in the industry?
Well, and certainly within the industry now, and certainly where you work and draw a paycheck, there's been a lot of change from there. And look, mergers and acquisitions are nothing new and nothing foreign to this industry. It's been a rite of passage for decades, and that's part and parcel of course, of a lot of different industries. Part of it is that the cost of capital, the cost to operate, and different aspects of that get to be quite onerous, and then the competition for the volumes to move, the demand for services. It's not just moving volumes, because it's more than that. There's a service that you're providing. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people, because at the end of the day, it's show me, the bottom line, show me what we can do here. Because we got creditors coming after us, we've got shareholders and stakeholders, we've got other things at play. And that gets to be challenging to try to find innovation in an industry that takes a lot of ramp up time. I mean, the barriers of entry are relatively low, although they've gotten a bit more onerous with different regulations or different requirements of the industry. And then, of course, the costs have become quite extraordinary in the side of equipment manufacturing, and be able to finance that. Look, we didn't know how to spell interest rates just a few years ago, and now interest rates are at the core of a lot of what we do. And when you think about the consumer debt, and quite frankly, the U.S. debt that's some 70 trillion, whatever, and consumer debt's about 17 trillion, and credit card debt is about 1 to 2 trillion. And on interest rates that are phenomenal, the cost of capital is very, very important, that one needs to be factoring in, and it's just catching up with a lot of people when they see those. And so those barriers get to be a bit more challenging. And so be able to build new equipment, the cost that's associated with it, the steel, the supply chain, and such, that gets to really push the pencils even harder. And innovation may get a little bit more problematic, because at the same time, this industry, not like some others, does have a labor issue, and to try to be able to hire crew members, to people to come into an industry that has a very different cadence to it, is quite challenging. And then as part of that is you've got different sort of cycles that you go through, and this industry is fraught with the different environments, not only with natural disasters or weather events. And I put those in two different buckets, because those are important, because the weather has quite an impact, as we know, whether you have high water, low water, and such. Climate impacts or natural disasters, whether hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever, have major impacts. But then the weather goes up further stream, especially in agricultural production, where we know that on the dry bulk side, you got well over 2/3 of the volume that's moved in a covered hopper barge is farm related in some way or another. And the ton miles are even more off the charts on what's required. So you get a lot of problems that way, where you could have that weather impact but you have then, of course, the natural cadence of the economies around the world. And the United States is, the United States has got the sniffles. There are countries in the world that are sneezing, and they've got pneumonia. And so on one hand, we've got some resiliency in our system. On the other hand, the cycles of this business, if you're new to the business, you're an MBA coming in and trying to put together the Porter sort of process on things, you're going to get lost, because you've got to see how these cycles work out here. And I think with a gentleman like Captain Greer, what he has seen in his career, not only here in the United States, but what he saw in South America and then come back to the United States, he understands quite well, as does several of the leadership in this industry. Look, you got to prepare yourself for some of these things. So innovation sometimes takes a back seat, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have to. And there's that service component. And I know many, they have tried to offer different services, whether it's through more getting inland further. Let's face it, the barge market certainly offers a lot of advantages from fuel consumption and the level of emissions. By itself, in its own nature, it is very economical, and it's very much a sustainable option for moving cargo, not just low value bulk commodities that are often associated, whether it's coal or grains or sand and gravel and such. But it's doing a very important service to the industry. But how do you leverage that? And that always gets to be the challenge. And really, I've worked with a number of people who want to put terminals in, and they look at, hey, how much can we get further? With one, we want to have river access, but how can we have multimodal access, where we've got rail, and the rail actually takes us, instead of running the river that we get 1,100 miles on a trip, but then we can get another 600 1,000 miles on rail and be able to complete that journey in an effective manner. And so people are looking for those types of options, something they've always been doing, but how do you invest in it? And then there's, of course, a persistent discussion around container on barge. There's a group that's certainly with what Ingram and then SCF Marine have done, is really sustained sort of approach, in the sense that they've kept at it, and the way that they've done it has been very impressive. And then you've got some other groups that have tried that in different ways and at different times, when freight rates were so strong or something, they found an opportunity and you had equipment available to do it. Then there's another a group that wants to, the American Patriot Holdings Group, that is looking, how can we develop a container on vessel, where you've got a self-propelled vessel that's going to be able to have containers loaded onto it, discharged along up in different points on the river, and then go back with, you got hydrogen that's being used, or a zero emissions fuel, and you've got different technologies that are being deployed. And so there's a lot of things to be looking at that gives a lot of different innovation. But it's not just what floats on the water, but it's also getting back into strategically thinking, how can we better manage our assets, run the assets, or then provide services that meet the needs of our customers at the end of the day. So that whole pie of innovation, it needs to be opened up. It gets boxed in because of some of those parameters, that high cost of capital, need to show me the P&L every month, and sometimes we can't really commit much resources for the long term. And some of these things, let's just face it, they're long term in nature. To build a barge or build a towboat, you're not just going to do it overnight. These are things that take a lot of lead time and require that. And sometimes the lead time misses out on the opportunity when what's the old expression? You got to strike when the fire's hot. So it seems like the fire keeps getting hot from time to time on different opportunities. And that's, how do you try to see that? And that's where, as an economist, we're always trying to use that crystal ball and help people see beyond the horizon, that you can't see things over the horizon. And that's something that I've tried to emphasize is, okay, what do we know that's at the horizon today? But that's old news. And then what can you see that's on the horizon? Well, you can kind of get there. Where you're kind of heading, what's coming. But the real fun part, in my mind, is what's over the horizon, to help with the scenario planning and try to help people walk through that journey. So it's a fascinating industry on the inland side, but it's more than just on the water. It's also the shore side, supporting the services that can go beyond and then come back to the river. And let's get into the world. The whole system's a giant funnel. And Frank Morton said that, when I remember him saying that. And we've always said that it's a giant funnel, the way things work. And you try to either move things out into the world, or you're moving things from the world into the United States. But there's also a lot of intra and intrastate movements as well that is very, very efficient in that regard. And how do you try to solve some of those dilemmas? Let's face it, in the trucking industry, the shortages of truck drivers are a perennial topic. And they can't seem to find a solution around that. And that's where, as we try to show demonstrate some work, where if you can just load trucks heavier, you can actually do it much safer, with more axles, more stopping capacity, and to be able to do less damage to the highways. And you can reduce the number of people driving and the number of trucks on the road and still move greater volumes. Some modes don't like that because they think it's competitive, but quite frankly, I think it's one of those things that the tide comes in and everyone wins, and they're short-sighted on some of those things and get lost on some of the technology we got. It's almost as if people want to operate in an environment where technology is never advanced on transportation or in different transportation logistics sectors. Well, technology has advanced. Our materials have gotten better. The barges that were built in the 80s and late 70s were very, very different pieces of assets than what were built in the mid 90s. And then those that are being built today with different coatings and different techniques, the technology's gotten better. And I think there's a unfortunate recognition of not seeing that. And it's, I don't know if it's implied or they don't want to admit to it because they want to just keep back and hold things back. The reality is, I think everyone can still win. And we have an economy in the United States that we want to see everyone win. And that's, I think, where innovation needs to be very forefront on people's minds, especially if we're in a slower part of an economy. That's the best time to start looking at innovation and doing some things that can make a difference when you come out of it. And we saw that with over and over again. There are many business cycles. As long as we let economics do its job, the most recent one has been with what went on in the fracking industry. When oil prices were going up, people started fracking like crazy. Then prices collapsed, and people came in and bought others out, pennies on the dollar, so to speak. And they turned them around and made them more efficient, lower the cost overall, and made for a more efficient system. But that's the part of innovation in the United States. We've always been a country that has always been innovative, and we just got to be careful not to allow policy or short-sightedness hold us back from using the tools that are in front of us. The whole area around artificial intelligence has got a lot of opportunity to help people leverage things. And one of the things I heard before Christmas when I was speaking in Louisville was a gentleman that said on a session from a farm, Bushel is the name of the group. His name is Jared. And he said, AI does not think, it creates. It still requires someone behind the AI thinking and how to put this together. And I think we're too busy trying to look at how to make pictures in AI when we could be deploying those assets to do some greater capabilities and to really bring thoughts alive. And there's a whole avenue of research and capability. And I know people are trying it and using it and finding success in what they're doing with that. So I think there's a lot of ways that we need to think differently with the way we're consider innovation as we go forward here.
We could very likely talk for about 3 hours just on this very topic. Thinking out loud, possibly into the future, maybe I can have David Greer back on with you, and you all can hash out some of these ideas. I think that would be very interesting.
That would be very interesting. I'd enjoy that.
Back to a few points you made. You mentioned the staffing issues for truck drivers. Has that been compared to the issues we're facing in the river system with deckhands and even pilots dropping out?
Not on a one-to-one basis. And I say it because, look, there's an advantage to the barge industry is that you kind of go unnoticed. When you're on the highway and you're in town and you're going to go over railroad tracks, inevitably you're going to sit there with a train going by, but you're going to wonder what's in that car. What could that be hauling down the tracks? And then, of course, you get behind trucks, and people have choice 4-letter words for trucks on the highways in most instances, unfortunately. And between here and Nashville on Interstate 40, my goodness, any one time, it just seems like all it is semi-trucks. But that's what's moving the economy. At the end of the day, we need trucks because they're the ones that are moving the economy. And that's where people can see it more acutely because it impacts every part of our economy. And so that gets a bit more attention. But I think the same thing certainly needs to be pointed out in not only on the deckhand side. And, with a lot of truck drivers, you've got two types of truck drivers, those that are able to stay local. And I was just having a conversation with a gentleman at my church on Friday morning about, one of their sons is just going through truck driving school. And he's looking at, should I go long haul? It's a bit more money, or should I try to stay local and I could be home every night? And so what's those trade-offs? And as we look at the towboat industry, I've had the privilege, Tim, to sit next to a number of deckhands on airplanes. Hey, how you doing? What do you do? And I remember a couple of them in particular. they tell me they're deckhands. I go, oh, this is gonna be fun. They're gonna hate me at the end of the day. And one of them I started probing questions. Well, what do you do? What, and I started asking, well, safety, does safety really matter? Do they care about that? I mean, it's just about getting the job done. Oh no, mister, safety matters a lot. And we go through some serious training to get it right, because at the end of the day, my life's at stake and I want to get home. And so I started asking the question, well, what's the benefits of barging? How do they pay for it and all that? He knew the answers. And it just wasn't one, it was two or three guys I would sit next to, or ladies. And it says two things. The industry and the barge operators have taken this view of training up crew members from the deckhands on up to understand the value of the system and what the contribution is to the economy. But at the end of the day, how do you try to win someone over that may be out for 28 some days on and 28 days off? And that gets to be problematic. And it takes a special person. I was in New Orleans at the start of February, going to the airport in a lift, talking to the lift driver. And guess what? He was doing lift on the side, and he worked on the barge, cleaning barges as his main job. And I said, well, why aren't you on the river? He says, man, I want to. I'm trying to get on the river. I said, look, you got my contact information. You let me know. I think this is where you need to go look here, here, and here. And he says, I said, it may not take you to want to do that because you could be gone a lot. He says, no, I want to move it up and do some things. Now, I don't know his backstory and everything, but here was a guy that was, to me, he spoke a lot in the sense that he had a full-time job cleaning barges when they were needed to be cleaned. And Lyft offered him the flexibility to work around that schedule, and he was trying to hustle it to make it happen. So how do you try to cater to people in that regard every day? And it's not just the towboats. You need welders, you need fabricators, you need people who can be out there in the elements, right along the shore, at the berth, at the terminal. And that's just a very difficult thing. And our society has always looked at, in the last couple of decades, about overlooking trade schools. I didn't know I was going to go to college until a woodshop teacher encouraged me. And I thank Mr. Weir indirectly, because I can't find him. But I tell you, I really am grateful for him to say, I think you could finish college. I said, what do I got to do? But the trades are phenomenal, and there's great opportunities for people in the trades to do things. And so the story is telling the story. And I think there's a number of groups that are trying to do that. You had Aaron Howard on, and known Aaron a long time. Aaron is probably one of the most persistent people I've ever met. No is not an answer she likes. She finds a way to try to turn it around and does a phenomenal job because she's so passionate about the industry, as are those who sponsor her and support her. I think it's great what she does, that type of thing, to try to get that exposure. And look, in sales, when I've been having to go find clients, and you put out so many proposals, you're not going to win every time. And there's a hit rate. So you've got to keep putting more out there to try to get a few to come back in. There are people who want to be able to experience things and see the rewards and what they could do to make a difference for the industry, and also, of course, for themselves financially and for their family, but how they can leverage that. As someone described to me, look, you're 6 months on, 6 months off. Those other 6 months of the year, there's a lot of things you could think about, you could be doing for yourself. And how do you try to win people in that regard? And that's the thing about on the water, long hauls. And that's true for long haul truck drivers. That's true for even for the railroad industry, that so many days on, so many days off, that there's not a new dilemma, but it's getting harder and harder in an environment where people look at different jobs that they want to try to do, or there's other incentive programs to keep them away from being hungry. One thing about innovation is that we really see a lot of inventors or entrepreneurs who come in to be entrepreneurs, waiting to be entrepreneurs when they get a little hungry. When baby's got to be fed, you're going to find a way to feed baby. But if someone else is going to pay you just to stay home and feed baby, why do you want to be innovative? Why do you want to have any kind of entrepreneurial spirit? This country was built on entrepreneurial spirit. And I think there's a lot of programs that the federal government does, and state governments even, on benefits for unemployment and such. And they're not wrong, but I think there's extensions of those that really kill some innovation and entrepreneurials. There are a lot of people who've got incredible, brilliant ideas that they just don't get enough time to feel the pressure to go out and just try it and see what could happen. And I think we're missing out on a lot of innovation in this country, of not letting people just get a little hungry and to be able to say, hey, I think I can do something, and then give them the freedom to do it. get out of their way and let them run with it. I mean, those are a number of ways. I'm kind of rambling on, but I think there's some things around innovation, entrepreneurialism that we kind of squandered that a bit in this country. And I think we need to make sure we can find ways to encourage people. And that's, I think, the inland waterways offers a great way. Look, if you look at the fire people, they work several days on or several days off type thing. And many of them have their own businesses or other things. And there's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit-minded people in those types of first responders that are out there doing some things and hustling it. It's fun to watch, and it's exciting to see what they're doing and trying to make a difference in their families, in their communities, and in what they're doing.
One more slight detour before we get more into your story, but you mentioned container on barge. How much have you studied that market in the U.S.?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of projects where in the past I've led some efforts of assessing, one, what's the draw area for it? What are some of the, first, what's available that can be done? And as part of that is around the backhaul. So there's a head haul that comes into the United States of containers, and we bring a lot of stuff in. I mean, we buy stuff and we wear it out and we go buy more, and it all comes back in by a container, more or less. Now I'm in Memphis. We got a little fly-by-night company called FedEx, and so they wake me up at early in the morning, and they're moving a certain amount of the economy, but they're nowhere near what the ocean side of things is doing. But nonetheless, if you look at container on barge, there's a number of parameters around that, and there's certainly an attractive market for especially U.S. agriculture and for recyclables, or even some say bulky items or even low value that can move in container that could be very much tributary to the river system. And so not only looking at the sort of respective markets, but also looking at the cost comparisons between the different options that are available, whether it's moving down the river system out of, say, Illinois or the upper Mississippi or off the Ohio River and then coming down past Memphis and all the way down, but also comparing the routes going to either the U.S. East Coast by rail or truck, and then looking at moving into container and transloading. A lot of that focused around ag commodities, corn, soybeans, soybean meal, distiller dry grains, solubles, and just understanding how those markets work. Done quite a bit of work around that for different associations and some corporations, but also evaluating for a group of this container on vessel and some of the options that could come from that. And there's always a lot of comparisons. Well, you can't get it on a per unit basis cheaper. Well, if you start working through a lot of the handling charges that take place here, or you start comparing the routings that take place, you can actually find that it's just as comparable, not only on time to get out of the United States into a destination market as compared to going, say, to the U.S. West Coast or East Coast, because you're running into other hindrances along the system. But you can find some leveraging points in the inland river system. But at the end of the day, it's an innovative process. And what is the time that we're going to displace some equipment maybe for other revenue opportunities? And that's where it comes down to. Well, at the end of the day, percent of tariff matters on the grain side of the business. Or, we got low water, we got high water. How is it going to operate in those environments when you got a container vessel that's on a scheduled service? And so that gets to be some of those complications. And so just understanding some of the economics and some of the process and then the time and consideration, a lot of that have done some work in and around that market over the last, probably 15 years. Back when I was at USDA, I was leading some efforts on the early on, looking at moving ag commodities in container.
What is the current market profile, I guess? What's the capacity on the barge side of things?
In terms of for containers or for overall?
Right.
For the containers, it's very limited right now. And with what SCF has done out of Memphis and Baton Rouge down to New Orleans, that's been some of the main routes. You have seen over in the East Coast, to say Richmond, Virginia, there was a program that was put in place to move trucks off the road, containers, and move them down to Norfolk, Virginia. And they were seeing continued increase because the goal there was we need to remove trucks from the road for safety reasons, congestion, emissions, and sustainability. So they were looking at it from a number of different angles in that regard. And it was a short move, but it was a very important move. And then you could also take advantage of heavier weights that you could load on to a barge and move it to a terminal and then leave it on the terminal, go to a ship, and not have to be on a highway. And so for them, there was a program in place that they were offering so many dollars per container equivalent that they would give credit towards. And I haven't looked at it for a couple of years since before COVID, where that program stands. But there's a few of those, but there's not many. There were some on the Columbia Snake River system, where there was a lot of frozen potato products in particular, moving out of the Tri-Cities area of Washington State and then being barged down to the containers on a barge into Portland and put on some vessels there. Except that most of those vessel lines ended up pulling out of the Portland area, and that kind of kicked the container on barge to the wayside at that time. But it's one of those things, is that it's fits and starts, try to get some things going. It's just proof of concept, dedication to a plan, and just watching some of those innovative opportunities that can come, and to be able to show not only terminal operators or container vessel operators and owners some of the benefits, and they get it, but they also are succumbing to the rules of profitability. They'll cut a lane. If you got a string of ships on a lane, they could cut that overnight and leave a lot of equipment stranded. And that's happened in many instances. But there's also then talking to the shippers, understanding, all right, what can we do here? Because at the end of the day, from the logistics standpoint, if the delivery time says it's going to be, say, 3 weeks, make it 3 weeks. Don't make it 2 weeks. Don't make it 4 weeks. Make it 3 weeks. And some people want to argue that the container and barge on the Mississippi River system and its tributaries is a little bit slower. Well, that's not necessarily true. You can walk through a number of examples that we have put together and that are in the public domain that shows how I estimate it with the team I was working with. But at the same time, if you're able to work with someone on inbound movements and understand what's the logistics look like and to meet the schedules that people have, same thing on the outbound, you can start to put together a whole supply chain. And of course, people say, well, that can go back to your comment about interest rates. Well, that's a very important part of that. But it's also, how do you control and contain and manage a supply chain where you have options for yourself, not just through one coast of the United States or the other coast of the United States as your option. You've got the U.S. Gulf Coast. And the challenge is you need available containers, empty containers, to come into the system and in order to be able to export product out in a container. And we've seen that on the grain side of things to do that. So on the barge side, it's relatively small. It's not as large. If you think about on the ag side, about 3 to 5% of weekly grain export inspections move in a container. And at the end of the day, of the whole grains that are being inspected, that's probably, if I really push the pencil hard, I could probably get to 150,000 containers. If I look at all ag commodities, just strictly ag commodities, I was doing this just recently for an exercise, it got to be about 1.3 million containers, but we do about 20-some million containers of imports a year into the country. So that's just a drop in the bucket. Most of those containers leaving the United States are moving with pristine oxygen or rust and dust at the end of the day. They're not doing much other than being repositioned. The challenge is showing those container carriers and the whole logistics supply chain how they can be an innovative way to do business with people and make that happen. So the barge market has got some steady volumes with what SCF and now, of course, Ingram has been able to do. And I think there's some, depending how it goes, I think there's some great minds that have done some work internally at both organizations that understand those markets well. Elsewhere, other companies have done the same thing. It's just a matter of dedication and determination and be able to stick to that process.
It is quite an opportunity. I was involved with it for a little while. Let's get into your story. We're already about a half hour in. What was your familial connection to the industry?
Well, for the barge industry, it was more the waterways industry. And I grew up on the West Coast, south of Seattle, Washington, in a town named Puyallup. And not many people can pronounce it, let alone spell it. But it was right next to the Port of Tacoma. And my family, my dad and brother and uncles and cousins, they were longshoremen, local 23 in Tacoma. And then some of my other uncles were walking bosses. They were in local 52. So I got introduced at a very young age, being around the waterfront, being down there regularly. Ships would come in, my family would be on lines. We'd help. I wouldn't help. I'd just be there, watch them tying up ships. And but then I also had a grandpa that was in my mom's dad, who was in the railroad industry, and really ran a lot across the Northern Pacific, then the BNSF over time. So I had an interest there, but didn't really think much of it. I did get some exposure right out of high school to work out of the Longshore Hall. My dad and my uncle were able to get me in as a college, or as a college casual, really, to work through college. And then I really started to see what was taking place, moving on the water system, learning a different trade, if you will, and some of the challenges and safety issues, but also the efficiencies that were coming. This is back when containerization was still fairly embryonic in the 80s when I was first started down there, and I ended up going through about the mid 90s. So that was my introduction, Tim, was kind of through just being around it, growing up with it. And the other side of it is I got a chance. I thought I was just going to be a landscaper, and I was going to go off and make my first million right out of high school and landscape. And then my wood shop teacher, Mr. Weir, said, I think you could go to college and finish. And he set me on a different course. And so between my sophomore and freshman year, or junior year in college, I went with the Future Farmers of America around the world and visited, long stayed in about 4 countries, visited 29. When I came back, I started out at the community college, spent 3 years doing it at the community college. I'd work 1 quarter and then go to school for another. So it's kind of half time just to make money to pay for the education. Well, when I came back from overseas and got into agricultural economics, there was a professor, Dr. Ken Cassavant, that was a transportation expert. Man, just really kind of connected the pieces that I saw. And that's where it really started to move me in a direction. And then through college, undergrad in ag econ, got on with, stayed on for grad school, a master's degree with Dr. Cassavant, and really had an emphasis in agricultural transportation. And then that took me to Washington, D.C. But it was really through my family and some experiences that sort of awakened me to see it was out there. But I think that practical experience on the docks, being on the ship, seeing some guys get hurt, seeing myself experiencing getting hurt, seeing a guy pass away, unfortunately, and nearly escaping a serious injury myself, you start to appreciate this is not a cakewalk that goes on out there. So be able to experience that was quite unique, to say the least.
Had you had much exposure to the inland rivers barge industry prior to college?
No, I didn't. I mean, I was aware of it just because of the work on the waterfront, and I sort of pay attention to the Columbia Snake. But no, I didn't know much about the Mississippi River system, quite frankly, until I got into graduate school and started studying things from a big picture at that time.
Any interesting stories about your childhood? I guess your life all the way up until 96, landing with the federal government.
Yeah, that experience of being able to work on the waterfront, be able to have my own landscape business, if you will. I was also someone's time, an orthodontist friend of mine, and where I grew up, I was his handyman, and I got to do a lot of neat things with them, and he entrusted me to do a lot of neat things. But I had a lot of flexibility. I had a mom that was very supportive, and she was in the title business, and there's another story with all that. But it was a great childhood growing up. But I think the exciting thing was when I went overseas, be able to see what was taking place, working on farms, and then having an interest of coming out of the working on as a longshoreman and seeing trade wherever I went and try to get to the water. I had a draw to the water overseas, and that just continued on. And quite frankly, kept up with people all these years that were overseas. And in fact, I was in Australia speaking to a group down there last July, I think it was, and was able to spend some time with a group, a family person that I lived where I lived in Australia. He drove 3 hours to have breakfast with me and to keep up with a lot of people around the world. That's the fun part, and to be able to do some of the things. One of the ones that is fascinating, Tim, I had a project when I got out of government. I escaped government and was with Sparks companies at the time. And I was over in Ukraine on a project looking at ports and terminals, assessing what kind of commodities could flow, what directions. And I hired interpreters and a driver. Well, this one interpreter, he said, wait, we're going to, before we go onto the property, I got to go talk to this person. This is, again, the early 2000s. He said, this is all KGB. And so he says, just hold the newspaper up when you go through the gate. Don't say a word. Don't put the paper down, whatever you do. Don't speak We don't want to cause a problem. So we did all that, and that's another story. But the neat story, because it ties back to my trip before I went around the world. We went to dinner that night, and we're small talk. I said, well, of course you were in the military, and so we're in the Soviet Army. Where were you based? And he told me some places. He said, penultimately, I ended up at Checkpoint Charlie. I said, oh man, I got to spend some time there. I was there 1 year after the wall came down, and their first Christmas, man, it was just magical and all that. And I said, the funny thing is, I was in at Checkpoint Charlie at Brandenburg Gate. I really don't know what Brandenburg Gate was at the time. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have smart devices. We just had to try to figure out on our own. I go to my cousin's. He's down at the Rock in Gießen in the military. I'm going to spend Christmas with him. Well, I get there that night, and come to find out, Brandenburg Gate was just handed over from the Soviets to Western Germany. And that day, oh, that's pretty cool. I took pictures of it. It was pretty neat. Well, long story short, this guy who was in the military for the Soviet Army, he was the official liaison through that whole transition period, handing it over. He was also the official photographer. So he and I were taking pictures of the same event at the same time. And then, I don't know, 20 years later, we meet in Ukraine and talking about projects and stuff. So, some of those things, the thing about it being a small world, it really is, and it's really exciting in that regard. But, the experiences to be on the waterfront, travel, and see the world in a bit smaller sense, that there's a lot of complexities that make this world small. And a lot of people like yourself and others that help make it small. And it's just not magic fairy dust. It is something that takes place every single day, and it's a battle. And that's where people have to be prepared in the contingencies that they need to have with that. So those were formative years. I really enjoyed that. And like my time growing up was great to be able to work in the waterfront and hear stories and work on ships. Whether there was so much work in those days on log ships to container ships that were starting to come in, iron ore ships, bauxite or alumina ships, and such. And one night I was down in the hold of an iron ore ship, and if I'm going to work on the hold of a ship, that means I'm digging ribs. They're packed full. They're old Greek ships packed full of iron ore. Down there digging and digging and digging, and it was dark out, and there's this dunnage, plywood and then cable. Well, I hit this one. It was dark, and the cable flung up and hit me in the face, and it knocked my tooth out. So I'm down there trying to find my tooth, and the foreman comes down. Eriksen, what are you doing? I said, I'm trying to find my tooth. And so he goes, what happened? So I told him. He goes, but I said, I think I found it. So I found it. He goes, well, you're not bleeding. I said, oh, don't worry about it. I'm a Christian. I asked Jesus to heal me. He goes, well, what are we going to do? And so we got off the ship, went up to the dock foreman to, I can't remember his name now. And he says, oh, you won't believe this, Eriksen got hit by cable, his tooth got knocked out, but there's no blood because he believes in Jesus and Jesus healed him. And the foreman said, well, how am I going to do the paperwork on this one? So, it's kind of still Wild West days, but it was a fun story to tell him. I had a false tooth that got knocked out when I was a kid it's a long story there, but the waterfront was a very intriguing and exciting place to see things come alive. And look, there were some dangerous things. I also saw some things that I probably shouldn't repeat because I did get in trouble once speaking at an event where I did say something, and there were some longshoremen present, and they didn't like that. So those were fascinating days.
Without a doubt. You stopped a few times in that last bit. You said there was a story to your mother and her title business.
Yeah, so my parents divorced when I have a twin sister, and they divorced when we were 7 years old. And so she went to work working in a title business just with a group. And so she, worked really hard to try to help raise us. And at the same time, my mom's parents divorced. My grandpa was in the railroad business and such. And so grandma moved in, and grandma never worked. So she went and got a job. And so there were 3 women and me. But my mom was just a great lady who just worked hard and found a way to pay the bills and really worked hard I was telling this story the other day at Christmas time. She even found a way to, if you may be too young, Tim, but sticky fingers were a type of jeans back in the day that were expensive, and all the kids had them. And somehow my sister and I got even sticky fingers. So it just showed how my mom worked hard to provide as much as she could. And she always had the sense that if I do for one twin, I got to do for the other one. I got to balance it out. So it was always great to be able to have that as a mantra with her. She was a gift, that's for sure. She was taken too young, but she was like the ever-ready bunny. She had 2 or 3 cancers, a couple of heart attacks, and kept living and outlived some of the others that were supposed to have lived longer than her. So I give her a lot of credit for tenacity in her life.
Without a doubt. You mentioned too, trying to sort of coexist alongside the KGB. And there was another story that came to mind that you didn't share yet. Is that worth sharing?
Yeah, other than they said, look, the KGB is still all over the place here in Ukraine at the time. This is early 2000s. And he said they're not going to be too kind to you doing some research here and understanding their ports. And we just want to protect you and your project because you're paying me to do something. And so if they start asking questions, you do not, whatever, in any uncircumstance, put the paper down. It says, I'm trained, I know what to do with these things. And it was just that there was KGB everywhere, and they just warned that you just still need to be conscientious of that. And that was very true. I did some work in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we saw some things like that where people will be watching very closely and measuring your steps and what you're doing. But never really felt threatened. I just knew that I had to be conscientious of my surroundings that were there, and we're just warned by a number of our folks that I was doing work for in those countries to be conscientious of what was taking place there, because they were still very active then in trying to look at that. Look, we'd go show up at a place that was, say, some sort of facility, and really there was a figurehead who was former KGB or something, and it was really run by women, and they were phenomenally clean facilities. And I tell you, compared to a lot of Western facilities of similar types, night and day, and they were well taken care of, well run. It's just that there's a figurehead who sat there and was told what to say, but he was KGB, so just had to be conscientious of what they were doing. And I can only imagine now what it's like. I'm sure I probably won't be in Russia anytime soon, and even quite frankly, Ukraine, unless I'm going over to be a part of some health situation, missionary type thing. But beyond that, it's a very different environment now. What was there, because KGB had never went away; they were still very much in existence.
Well, let's bring this back to the U.S. here. You joined the USDA in '96. You mentioned my age. I was 10. Is that when you began studying or I guess analyzing the barge fleet profile?
No, that was later when I left USDA. And when I was at USDA in their transportation group, I had a couple of roles there. One was I focused a lot on the ocean freight side of things, and so got to do a lot of work in and around that. But we also served at the pleasure of the Undersecretary of Agriculture, and then also with the administrator of the Agricultural Marketing Service. And we were a unique group. And really, when something would come up, we'd provide some sort of perspective on what it means to move commodities. Look, one of the things that in our merchandising schools that I used to lead, we would say, and even today when I lead courses, I've been starting to do some more now that I'm on my own, was you're not trading corn, you're not trading coal, you're not trading oil, you're trading freight. So you need to understand freight. And to understand the freight, you got to understand those rolling and floating assets, whether it's barge or ocean or rail or truck, and pipeline, but that's a little bit unique. But to understand those assets, you need to understand the underlying infrastructure to them in which they roll over or float on. And not only that, once you start building that up, then you can understand, well, what's moving in those. And for a barge, a covered hopper barge, there's kind of agnostic, because you take the lids off, it's an open barge. Everyone's saying duh, but you've now got some unique things there. So they're kind of agnostic, whether you're moving coal, salt, grain, steel, windmill parts. Maybe some cleaning things that need to go on. I don't want to oversimplify it, Tim. You all do a great job. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated with the tank side of things, and there's several different more types of tank that are in the marketplace. So that's where understanding transportation is very important. And that's where, when we were at USDA, and they still have that group today, they provide some data. And one of them is the barge fleet, or the barge freight rates that come out once a week. And they've been doing that for decades. And then also some of the car loading data and some other data, except that now I think the level of transparency has become a little bit more constricted, because people don't want to reveal as much anymore, and we're getting a little bit more tightened down. And I think that's kind of a short-sighted move, because you need to be able to monitor the system overall to understand where the choke points could be. But putting that aside, was able to be at USDA. Then I took on what they call the modal share report, looking at how grain is moved within the United States to get to a market position. And whether it's to a domestic position for domestic use, whether it's a soybean crush, corn grind facility, or feeding position, or to an export position, and that'd be an export move. So I'd be looking at the different modes by truck, rail, or barge, and they're really the long haul moves, and to develop those as part of that. So that was, and then I jumped into the container market early on. Just part of that is because I was in the waterfront as a longshoreman, saw that, and I thought, boy, there's something we could be doing here. And there were already some folks doing some things in a slightly different group, but we started enhancing those and evaluating what went on container side of things. But at the end of the day, bulk grains, they do move in bulk ships and bulk barges and bulk rail cars, and not so much containers. But there's opportunities in that. So those were some of the things at USDA where I got introduced then to the inland river system more succinctly, and got I did at Washington State University, where I was in grad school with Dr. Cassavant. I was able to then study a lot of that there and get a good foundation. And then he entrusted us, maybe too much so, to be able to do a lot of neat studies and do a lot. One of the things I learned from him was, if this study has no practical value other than it's going to sit on a shelf somewhere, I don't want to do it. And that was one of the mantras that continued on. How do we deliver value for customers and bring that value service alive for them? So USDA, I felt they had some things they were doing that were very beneficial, but was able to jump ship out of that group later on when I was there.
Well, what can you tell me about the barge fleet profiles for dry cargo and for liquid cargoes, if you have that information, and how maybe when you first started digging into those things, how it's changed today?
Yeah, so when I so I left Ag Marketing Service, where the transportation group was at USDA, went to the National Agricultural Statistics Service, where I was setting national estimates on commodities. And in two different ways I was tasked. One was to build up the database on genetically modified organism data that we were collecting as an agency, and two, to be able to collect chemical use data and to build surveys around those. And those were admittedly some of the most complicated surveys that were done, but they had the highest response rates because farmers saw that there was a benefit. If they give good information, and that can be used. In this case, it was going to be used by the Environmental Protection Agency. EPA then changed some of their levels or rules on some of their the chemicals and the way they can be used. And there's another story with how EPA looks at things. They think things conservatively, that people, like farmers, are applying pesticides or fertilizers at the highest rates as frequently as possible. Well, in no one's right mind would you ever do that, because it's expensive. It's just expensive, and you don't need to do it. You can do a lot better. And so the surveys came back with results that said to EPA, this ain't happening, folks. And EPA accepted those. And so that was really exciting. Well, I was there for a while, and I got a call. Hey, there's a group in Memphis that's looking for a transportation analyst. And long story short, was able to join the Sparks companies here. And Dr. Sparks is an intriguing person. And unfortunately, he passed away far too young. Kind of the purveyor of the supply and demand table that is in use today all over the world. And when I joined here, he had actually owned barges himself, and he had several that were with Memco, and then they got moved over in different areas. But that group, when I came in, Sparks Companies had bought what was called the Barge Fleet Profile at the time, that was published by Jack Lambert and together with Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown was at Cargill, and Jack Lambert was up in Minneapolis. And so Sparks Companies took it over in the mid to late 90s, and I joined in early 2000s, 2001, and that was already underway. And then I came and was leading the group and was able to just come alongside and not make too much of a mess of it, but we're able to start looking at some of the value that comes from that, and launched a barge fleet profile, which is a fundamental view of the barge market. And you put together the supply, what moves in the barge type, whether it's dry cover, dry open, or tank, and then you put against it the fleet count of that type, and now you got a balance table for that barge type. And quite frankly, that comes together with a barge pressure index, and that's something that Dr. Sparks had developed, where quite frankly, it's arithmetic. It's very simple. You're looking at the pressure of how big the fleet is to some time frame in the past, or the index the fleet to some time in the past, and you index the commodities moving in that barge to some time in the past, and you just take the difference of the two, and that's a barge pressure index. And if the index is rising, that means the fleet's under more pressure. Conceivably, freight rates should be going up, and there should be then the incentive at some point to build more barges, because prices are going up, revenues are going up, and so the converse is true too. If the index is falling, there's less pressure on the fleet. Either there's too many barges or not enough demand, either one or both. Lately, it's kind of been both. And so you had less pressure, freight rates would fall, collapse, and you could see M&A or people going out of business or whatever. So kind of as a background to that, we kept the barge fleet running through all the successive companies. So when I went to join Sparks companies, Dr. Sparks was contracted with cancer. And rather than taking longevity, he took quality of life and sold our company, Sparks Companies, to Informa PLC, one of the world's largest publishing exhibitions company. And we were largely left alone as Informa Economics from 2004 up until about 2015-16, when Informa started aligning all these different companies together. But at the barge fleet profile, we kept that going. And then as we rolled up as companies, Informa ended up selling the Agri Group out of itself to IHS Markit. And we were there in July of 2019. And then November 2020 was announced that we're going to merge with S&P. Well, somewhere along the line, the decision was made, we're going to discontinue the barge fleet profile in calendar year 2022. So the last survey that I did was in 2021. But one of the things from those trends was, one, the different periods. You had the big buildup of barges in the late 70s, especially with covered barges and dry covered barges. A lot of that was for investment purposes, but there was an investment tax credit that was available, and professionals, whether it was lawyers, doctors, and others, took advantage of that and had a lot of incentives around that. And so those fleets just got big. And then all of a sudden you had a period from about 1981 until really early 1990s. We really had very weak demand. We had very minimal to zero new builds of equipment. And that was true not only of dry coverage, but also dry opens and tanks, and even some of the towboats. We just didn't invest because we had a very a down market during that period for movements. And we had too big of a fleet, because there was, again, if we let economics do its job, and we put this big credit thing in place that overbuilt the fleet, and that just hung on people for a long, long time. Well, then we get to the early 90s, and now some of that equipment, from the 70s, it's getting to be about 15, 20 years old, but it still didn't work much, but it was not built to the same specifications, let's say, of a barge, certainly today, and certainly of a barge that was built in the mid-90s. And in the mid-90s, you had a bit better coatings, and today we even have better coatings, better welding, maybe some better steel along the way. That's gotten better. But at the end of the day, you got to the mid-90s, and then we started seeing demand really ramp up, start to turn. We had a big demand pull for ag commodities. If you look at what moves on the river system, it's about 500 to 600 million tons of cargo every year. And most of that is going to be around what moves in an open barge or a tank barge. But if you look at ton miles, that's where the dry barges just ramp up, because their average distance haul is much, much longer, sometimes upwards of 4 to 5 times as long. And so you see the demand on the ton mile basis is very, very strong for a covered hopper barge. So, and those are really, over 2/3 of that, it was focused on the grain, ag, crop side of things. And so goes the crop market, so goes some of the dry cover. And quite frankly, what that meant for some of the revenues for other types of business, if you had dry equipment and some liquid. If you're, a liquid carrier, you had different markets that you focused on. So when we saw the barge market start to build out in the mid 90s, we built a lot of barges then as well. And at that time, you had several builders. And as we got through that, and then it slowed down again because we overbuilt, and then we had not the promise of 2 billion bushels of corn exports every year. It actually was always a little bit less than that. But then you got into the early 2000s, 2005 in particular, where you saw on a global scale, the economics just changed dramatically. China, like all of a sudden realized, one, we got a large population around here. They got to be fed. They got to work. We can be very much an industrial base. And they started building steel plants and factories to build all these widgets that we wanted and that we would use for a while, throw away, and then buy them again, and they'd send it over to us. And they started building, skyscrapers and other things to try to accommodate their economy and their housing. And so now we're seeing all this iron ore, coal things running, and you saw the CRB index. It's a commodity index, if you will, of different, steel, iron ore, coal, grains, livestock, and other commodities that go into this index. And man, it was just going strong. And quite frankly, when you look at that against some other measures of what was going on in the barge market and on the ocean freight side and on transportation in the United States, they were all moving very similarly in some of their patterns there. And then you get into the unfortunate 2008 when, and of course, there's 2001 with 9/11. That was an interruption and disruption, but it also opened up some, reshoring of things for some people in some countries holding on to stuff. This is like, we can do better for ourselves. But then in 2008, you had the whole deep recession that we experienced, and that really slowed things up. But at the same time, you had the great build out for ethanol. And you saw this big shift in acreage for corn, a drop in soybean area. And we just built like crazy to accommodate 36 billion gallons a year in ethanol. Not all corn, but that was a big part of that. And so we ended up seeing at that period, we saw where Iowa was historically a surplus state of corn, meaning they produced far more corn than they were going to use within their boundaries, and they'd ship it out of the state, mainly by barge to the Mississippi and move it down to the Center Gulf. They went to become a deficit state on corn until 2015, when we finally got to a point where average yields, bushels per acre, got to a point that we could sustain a growing crop on the same amount of acres. And now we don't need as much corn going, any additional corn going into an ethanol plant. We kind of hit that. Now we had a surplus available. All that to say, Tim, if you look at 1979 to 81, a big build out, then nothing. And then we got to the mid 90s and we had a big build out again. Then we started getting into retirements in the early 2000s from that 80s fleet, because, dry covered barge, maybe 25 to 30 years, sometimes longer, sometimes not as much. A dry open barge is probably closer to 20 years, more or less. And then you take some of those old covered barges, rip the tops off permanently, put them in open service for a few more years, get a few more turns and make some revenues off those. Tanks are altogether different because they have whole different rules and regulations. I won't go there at the moment, but we can talk about that. So you get into the 2008, all of a sudden you go, man, we're going to see our exports. And then at the same time, you had China starting to ramp up on soybean imports. China has, if you take all the pigs in the world outside of China and put them together, they still don't add up to as many pigs as China has. They are a big pork producer in China, and it's remarkable. It's 750 million pigs they have in that country, and it's remarkable. So those pigs like to eat two things. Well, at the time, they like to eat a lot of things just from the backyard, whatever you fed them. But corn, soybean meal were the big components. And then they started getting better at feeding their pigs and try to industrialize them and really reward farmers for doing that. And we saw that really take off, and that really led to a lot of soybeans then heading towards China. And we saw two things that happened, especially as you got into 2009, 2011. And this is that, one, the United States, we started seeing a new export elevator being built in the Pacific Northwest. Well, what that did up there was two things. One, it woke people up and led them to then expand their own facilities that were up there. So you almost saw a doubling of capacity in some cases of volume that can move through the Pacific Northwest. So whether it's on the Puget Sound, Seattle, Tacoma, on the Columbia River, Longview, where the new facility went, Portland, Vancouver, Washington, Kalama, you really saw an expansion. But it also woke up the U.S. Gulf, where, if you look at the PNW, they send grain and corn and soybeans to, say, 5 markets. The Gulf sends it to probably 3 dozen markets. And so, but at the same time, the Gulf started enhancing their throughput capability and be able to handle more grain and more volume through the U.S. Gulf. And so to monitor what the capacity utilizations were for grain to move through the system and marry it up with the barge market got to be important. So in 2008, we saw some of that slow down, but then we started seeing maybe opportunity coming. And then we had the drought of 2012. And that really did a number, because our corn exports, say, went from simple arithmetic. Remember, I'm a longshoremen's kid. They went from 2 billion bushels down to less than 1 billion bushels. That's a huge drop on exports. It actually went down to 723 million bushels. And that just brought us to a standstill until we got out to the harvest starting in 2013 and into 14. And then from there, we had near perfect growing conditions. In 14, 15, 16, 17, we grew phenomenal crops, and we started exporting like crazy. And we tried to start doing some building. But then in about 2016, after the merger with ACBL and AEP, there was a decision that was made to close up Jeff Boat permanently. And now, from a building standpoint, you really had one builder, and they went from being known as Trinity to being Arcosa. And then you still had, of course, Brownsville Marine or Heartland Fabrication that could crank out a few barges, where ACBL, Jeff Boat or Trinity could crank out a dry barge a day, a tank barge a week. Heartland can do maybe a dry barge a week and a tank barge a month. So very different scale. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different scale of operations. So that became a barometer to the system here. So we've got a barge fleet that you're not really going to add much capacity. The question becomes, do we want to add more capacity? Because you've got a change in the grain markets. 2018, when it was actually April 4th, 2018, China overnight said, we're going to put a big old tariff on U.S. Exports coming to China. Man, overnight, the soybean market, the corn market, all were limit down on the Chicago Board of Trade. And at that point, things came to a standstill. And we see that in other parts of our history. September 22nd, 2000, we found Starlink was found in our corn exports going to Japan. That stopped all trade. And all of a sudden, you just saw a slowdown and a stop of things. And those things are very important from policy and from implications, how it backs up into the system here. So you had this market here in 2018. Okay, well, if you're going to do that, China, we're going to do this to you. And that led to our great trade war. And that really then had been the case, leading a lot of production to South America. And South America really woke up. And they've now outdo the United States in soybean production. They're moving fast out to the United States in corn. You plant a new hectare of soybeans in South America, you get a hectare of corn, because they'll harvest the soybeans, plant the corn on that land. And it's remarkable what they've done. And they've really filled the gaps. And that's where you come back to my construct, where if you have an interruption in transportation or a policy or something here in the United States or some other place, that's going to filter through and reward people someplace else. Because at the end of the day, someone wants and needs what you were sending them. They're going to find it someplace else. And I think China had done a good job over the years of incentivizing Brazil to expand their soybean production area, for the reason that China needed a soybean crop every 6 months anyways, to feed their pigs, that people love their pork in China. So those dynamics were fascinating. So that means a lot to the barge market and to the covered hoppers in particular. And of course, on the open side, what became a coal, and coal is boom bust, if there's ever boom bust, and it's gotten more so. Exports have been really good the last couple of years. We still have a few coal plants on the river system, but not like we used to, and there's going to be less in the future if things play out the way they are. So the barge market may be at a spot where it's got a good barometer. You can't really build a lot of equipment fast. I mean, we used to be able to do, 1,700 barges a year we could build. You're not going to ever get to that number again, given the footprint we got today. And so that gets to be problematic. And now, if there is a big push, say there's a big crop problem in South America, meaning a weather event of some sorts, and you can drain out the United States of some of their corn and soybeans. would we be in a position to support that in a hurry? And as we know, with rail cars and barges, they don't levitate and you can't move them fast. So you get a lot of challenges in that regard, and to make those things happen as we go forward here. It is, and that's where innovation has to be at center to some of that here. So the barge fleet, it's starting to age again. We got it fairly young and it's aging. And I'm grateful that the Waterways Journal started publishing. They bought the data to the barge fleet and they kept it going. And just last week, we worked together just recently, we worked together that I'm going to take over the barge fleet with them and start doing the survey on behalf for the Waterways Journal, powered by Polaris Analytics Consulting, and bring that the report that I was familiar doing in the past, and continue it going into the future, and working with the Waterways Journal to do that. So very exciting that they try to hold it together, and now together and working with the industry. And the industry is very good to respond to the surveys, to have a good product that goes out there and kind of be the standard that people measure the fleet by then.
Well, regarding the grain supply chain specifically, are we in balance with demand versus capacity? Is our infrastructure sustaining our needs? And what opportunities, I guess, do we have internationally to improve our numbers or export more?
Yeah, the challenge in the grain market is from a couple of different ones. And when I was at USDA, there was a gentleman there that used to say the greatest export market for US grains is the United States. And we've always been a residual provider to the world. We took care of our local demand first and our consumption. And consumption in the United States comes down to a few buckets. One, that you're going to move it into the feed channels to feed livestock, dairy, cattle, hogs, chickens. And so that's very much forefront. And so you take the corn and they can ship that and it can get cracked and used in that regard. Secondly, the soybeans will go to a soybean crush facility and they'll be crushed for one of two purposes, essentially: soybean meal or soybean oil. And we used to always do it for the soybean meal to feed all those critters. And then a lot of the oil we'd use domestically. Soybean oil's got so many uses, it's remarkable. But then we'd export a lot. Well, now we've got some new biofuels, renewable fuels regulations out there that are changing things yet again. And now we don't really have any more ethanol plants coming online. We are seeing some enhancements to get more ethanol out of a bushel of corn, or to use more of the corn oil, what have you. And don't forget, or maybe you don't know this, but I think Frank Morton said this, at an ethanol plant, you actually get, not only do you get ethanol, you get corn oil, you can also, another physical product is distilled dry grains of solubles, a very valuable feed component for livestock. And so that became very important to move, and China used to buy a lot until they banned it for whatever reason. They made up an excuse. That's the thing, China is very adept to making excuses. And there's a reason why you can't trust China. One, the US government finally realized that. We had always been saying, and that Dr. Sparks and others, you show the world ending stocks, and then you show another line, world ending stocks without China, because you don't trust China's numbers. And the federal government does the same thing. They talk about world ending stocks, then they say without China, because you don't trust China. And so China is one of those great liars about things, or they don't fully report the truth on things as what they've got available. They may not even know, quite frankly. People may be lying in the background to save their heads, literally, to try to get the right numbers. But that's another matter. Same thing that took place in the Soviet Union back in the day. So you look at what's going on from the use of grain. Here in the United States now, soybeans are being used with the oil to go into renewable diesel. And those are going into refineries, being able to be converted over, and then go to largely California, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast, maybe into Canada. And now other states are looking at allowing the use of renewable diesel, which has much lower emissions, a low carbon footprint, and to be able to use. Now, the problem with that is now we're seeing a number of soybean crush plants that have been propagated, and they're popping up all over the map. And we've probably still got about 15 or so that are under construction or about to start construction if they get the final financing. And that's about a 25% increase in soybeans being used in this crush business. That's very substantial, because we were now at a point we started exporting more soybeans than we were corn. And that's something we got to watch very closely, how that plays out. as it goes forward. The flip side of that is that oil will be used for the renewable diesel. What's going to become of some of that soybean meal that will be in surplus supply, and what type of markets will be open up? And there's a lot of work, and I've been asked a lot about that, of what would take place in that regard with the soybean meal, what markets could emerge and to use that, and how much can we stuff into some critter to get rid of it, quite frankly. So we've seen that shift, and now we're probably seeing less surplus supply, especially of soybeans, available to the global market the way it was. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. There's opportunities nonetheless, because there are keen buyers that really look at U.S. as a better place to do business, has a different type of commodity or product available to them. At the end of the day, we do have the benefit of our transportation system. Our cost of production is a lot higher than South America, but because of our transportation, it makes it more competitive, except that Brazil's catching up. And we got to watch how that happens. And that's where people just can't rest on their laurels. You got to rely on innovation and to say, hey, we can't just think survive on being because we're always the best. Well, someday people learn how to do better, and they want to be the best. And so we don't want to diminish that. The U.S. still has one of the best, finest collection systems for grain in the world. So on the ag side of things here, we're going to have a lot of corn available, but you got a lot of grain out of the Black Sea. Russia's got the world's cheapest supply of wheat right now that can be used for food or feed purposes. Ukraine's been exporting a lot of corn to China, and they're still finding ways to get through the Red Sea and all that debacle that's taken place there. And then South America, with their big corn crop, competes with the United States. So, hope on a weather event is not a plan, but it's a contingency that you got to be prepared for. But that's not the way that you do business. And so for the United States, it's looking at these markets a little bit differently. And you start looking at how do you compete for market share within the United States for the export volumes, and what markets you can serve in that regard as they go forward here. So Tim, I think in the next couple of years here, the farmers are starting to plant the crop for this year, and they're probably going to plant a little bit less corn, probably a little bit more soybeans. Their yields keep getting better. The good thing is you get more production off an acre of land, and that becomes available. But the soybean side is probably the one that we're gonna have the toughest battle. Our wheat exports have been on one direction, down, and a lot of competition around the world. Australia averted a massive drought from El Nino, and they got timely rains. That's probably going to help them, let them remain competitive in the market, where they had 3 years in a row, back to back to back record crops, and they were exporting like crazy. So it's a competitive world out there, and people have to realize you got to be competitive every day when you go look at these things and to work in this world market of grain.
Well, as you made mention of them, we'll certainly ask about it, but I dove into the tank logistics side of the business just a few months ago, and I'm still actively in that with the day job here. Tell me about the tank barge profile. I don't know a whole lot about it, admittedly. You mentioned ethanol. Is that the largest commodity moved in tanks?
No, within the tank side of things, you've got the petroleum side, and that's probably 50 to 60% of the tonnage. And then you've got the chemicals, which is probably about 30%. And then you've got this one that's just other. And I think if I remember right, I'm going off the top of my head now. I used to know this very closely. If you look at ethanol, I think it moves more in the chemical side of things, that it fits into that bucket. So the petroleum gets to be very important. And we did see a lot of crude oil that was moving on the system when the Bakken was really taking off. And we saw a lot of oil that was going towards Wood River would show up there. And especially when you saw the Brent and price of oil in London and the WTI West Texas Intermediate crude price widen. That's where you saw the oil move. And then the crude petroleum is the other one. So petroleum, crude petroleum, and chemicals. So crude petroleum is about 20% of the market share. Chemical petroleum is just about 19%, and then almost 60% is the petroleum products refined, and then farm products are fairly small. And I think maybe ethanol gets put in there, but from a standpoint of their long haul moves, and quite frankly, chemicals are long haul moves coming out of the U.S. Gulf, moving up the river system to Chicago or even towards Pittsburgh and other places. Those are nice long haul moves in that regard. And you see that in the ton miles. That's the ton miles things changed even more so on the market shares that each of those have then.
Do you have anything else to maybe to share before we jump into your your May 31st presentation at
Yeah,
IMX?
I would say, Tim, on the tank barges. So on the tank barges, Tim, the fleet itself, you've got four basic types of tank barges. And then within those, you've got different types of equipment within there. Some that have coils, some that don't, some that have heaters, some that don't. And then you've got, of course, stainless steel to many other types of compartments. You can put a number of them together to get a unitized tow that moves along. So there's a number of ways of characterizing that. You've got, you know, asphalt to clean equipment that moves. So it's a very unique market in that regard to break it down. And that's where trying to understand then understand what those chemical properties are of things, because that has a lot to do with how you manage your assets, and you know, what was the previous cargo and what type of cleaning needs to be done and all that. That's very intriguing. It's a lot of work, and and so the tank market is a very unique system into itself in that regard. But even the tank market, just because there's so much more steel involved, there's a lot more cost in the equipment, but it's moving steadily and it's under a constant contract. Most of it's contracted out. It's not spot market like grain in particular. And so those have different dynamics, and you're moving usually in some sort of unit tow, whether it's, you could tell me better than this, Tim, but 2 packs to 6 packs or whatever else that you're moving up and down the system with a dedicated towboat and crew. And so that it's a very unique model as compared to the dry side of the business that's out there. So I'd say that on the tank side, we don't expand that fleet that much. It stays relatively flat. It's increased incrementally over the years. I think, if I remember off the top of my head, the last number I had in my head is like 4,000 pieces of tank barges. But they're a bit harder to analyze and put together a balance table, because admittedly, when I build a balance table for them, I just have a tank commodities that moved in there and put all the tanks together. Well, that doesn't tell the whole story, because you really got to break it down by its components.
I don't know that you said it. What is the total capacity on the dry cargo side? You mentioned about 4,000 tanks, but what about hoppers?
Yeah, on the dry covered side, this is off the top of my head, I'm going to say 12,000 roughly. It's probably a little bit less now. And then on the dry open side, mainly barge and gravel and such, I think those were falling below 4,000, moving towards 3,000. I just thought, no, that may be wrong. They may have been around 6,000 and falling down towards 5,000, just off the top of my head, if I remember some of those numbers clearly.
Did you have anything else to add about the last few topics you discussed?
Yeah, you know, just with the barge fleet overall and the tank side, the tank market, we ended with that on, you know, 4,000 some barges there, again, rough numbers, and then on the dry cover, 12,000 some, and those kind of peaked out, and quite frankly, they're probably in a downward trend here. We're probably more in replacement mode on those, just because of there's just only 2 builders out there, and it's just, you know, as much as there's some labor issues on deckhand side, just to be able to get labor on the shore side for welding, fabrication, and such, it's just as dire. And it's going to be more of a hindrance as we go forward here. And again, to be able to attract different individuals to come into this industry and take advantage of the opportunities that are there's a lot to be had. And again, it's not for everybody, but it doesn't mean it can't be. And it's a great trade to have. A neighbor of mine, he was a World War II welder at the Bremerton shipyards, and he retired and became our neighbor. Man, he encouraged me in so many ways about welding, and just made it fascinating and making a difference out there. But today, I think the pay that one gets is a lot more attractive than probably what Mr. Morris was getting back in the day. And then on the open side, just with you know, on again, off again, exports of coal, where that could be going, energy transition that's under place, renewable fuels that are going to be some problematic issues. And that hits both the open barge and the covered barge. And even on the tank barge, I'll be curious to see what happens as we continue to be a country that wants to be energy independent, I think, is the desire of the administration. And of course, that changes from one administration to the next. And energy independence means we incentivize or take away hindrances for opportunities to provide a well-priced product into the marketplace. If someone's got a better widget or a better technique, boy, we want to let them go at it and try to do better, because that's innovation. And when we put constraints on that, we just put a noose around innovation real fast. And so to me, if we don't let economics play out, and there's an economic life cycle just as much as there's a product life cycle, where you got, a new product comes in, it's slow to get on there, it takes off, you get a lot of opportunity. People see someone's making a lot of money, others come in and compete against it. They probably get in at, at the top, and then you get a correction or something like that, or someone brings a better innovative product in there, or you get mergers and acquisitions, lower the per unit cost, and now you get more efficiencies. And that's just been something that's been in place for a long time. And not everyone will end up having the best new idea, but if we don't let them try, we'll never discover the next best idea. So I'd say in all of our discussion, there's going to take a lot of innovation to think through some of these things and what things could look like as we go forward here.
Okay, now thank you for sharing all that. Whittle down to just a couple more questions here, but I do hope, as I mentioned earlier, that we can reconvene later, because some of these topics we can probably devote entire episodes to. Possibly with some extra guests, and maybe not, but we'll see how that goes. But in closing, for this first of hopefully a few meetings that we'll have, you're giving a presentation May 31st at IMX, I believe, in Nashville this year. Off camera earlier, you mentioned also Kenny Brown and the Maritime Throwdown. How were you first introduced to IMX, and how did you, I guess, get involved in that side?
Yeah, I think I like that question. I've known Waterways Journal for many years. We did a lot of co-joined efforts with them. When I was at Sparks Companies and Inform Economics in particular, and even at IHS Markit, we, together with the Waterways Council Incorporated, and I know you've had Deb on here, and Nelson Spencer Sr., and us, we came together and co-hosted the annual Waterway Symposium. And so got to know them over the years, and they would, interview us. We would talk to them about certain things. We would even use and promote their inland river record, the towboat side of things, if you will. The towboat, if there's a barge fleet, there's a towboat fleet. And so they had the towboat side of things. And, and so through all that, and together with such a stalwart, such as the Craig Phillips and the Mark Canoys and many others in this industry, and Peter Steffeich, and I mean, there's so many to list that are stalwarts in this industry, and Rick Calhoun, and right down the list. So from that, we were able to work closely with them. And so when Nelson Spencer Jr., Spence, he got the idea there should be an event for the inland industry. And so I was talking with him early on in that, and bouncing ideas off one another. And so had spoke at the first 10 of those. I forget what year they're on, maybe first few. And then in our company where I was previously, before I was, if I can say, Tim, synergized out of a position, and that I was open door to other opportunities in life, not where I was, so to speak. We stopped speaking or co-hosting that event, IMX. And I think it's a great event that brings the industry together to allow for things to happen from the standpoint, one, you get to meet new participants, exhibitioners will get to show off their wares and maybe some new innovative products. And then you hear some different education sessions and such. And so with them, was speaking at that event for several years, and usually doing something on the state of the industry. I'd sometimes have different colleagues join me over the years at those events where I was working. And now that I'm on my own with Polaris Analytics Consulting, working with Spence closely. And so he's asked me to deliver the state of the barge industry, if you will, or the inland industry. And really part of it is because I'll be taking on the survey efforts for them, helping them publish a similar barge fleet profile report and a similar barge commodity profile we used to do, but under different names and maybe different titles and different ways of putting it out to the marketplace, and then bring those results at the Inland Marine Expo at the end of May. So that's a great annual event. I know a lot of different people, barge operators and shippers alike and freight forwarders and brokers will be on the sidelines negotiating. So there's business that gets done. And you also see new innovative products that will emerge there. And there's going to be opportunities for one-on-one side meetings. Private rooms will be available to have more in-depth conversations. And so that's very exciting to work with Spence. But it's a great program. They'd be able to see it move from its early days in St. Louis at the Union Station, move it to the big football arena there in St. Louis, and now in Nashville, which let's face it, Nashville is just like the epicenter of the universe at the moment here. And as a Memphian now, sometimes hurts, but hey, a rising tide lifts all boats, so we can't complain too much.
Absolutely. What do you think about old Kenny Brown and his little project? I'm sure if you were within 5 feet of him, you got to hear all about it.
Well, that's for sure. And I've enjoyed over the years to be able to watch and get close. And always in the last day in the past, as I remember, they'd have kind of the championship throwdown there. Man, that was just exciting. And man, heaving that rope, it brought back terrible memories. Now, I never had to heave anything like that all the time and do the things they did with the gear on and hard hat and the life preserver and all that. But boy, and in the conditions of moving on equipment, but boy, they sure make it look easy. But I think it's exciting, and it showcases the capabilities of the industry. And there's a competitive nature. Again, I think that goes back to our entrepreneurial spirit. We're always wanting to do better. And I think it's a great way for us to allow people to demonstrate their capabilities and to say, hey, I think I can do better than you. And that's a good program that he has going there. And that this year it's going to be I think it's going to be on the first day or the kickoff reception. And that's when you get the most energy. And I'll tell you what, some of my colleagues in the past, they come to a waterways event and they say that is the most exciting crowd there has to be. They are the most positive. It could be the world's burning down around them, but they're the most positive people. The waterways industry is always a fun industry to be around. So having them at the opening reception, I think that's the schedule, will be very exciting to see for sure.
No better way to end this one, my friend. Thanks very much for your time, Ken.
Thank you, Tim. Have a good one, and I look forward to catching up with you later.
Yeah, I think we'll look forward to some future conversations, I hope.
All right. Take care, my friend.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.